Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. We are covering breaking news for you. It sure seems like the manhunt for Brian Laundrie is over. The FBI now confirming that investigators found what they say appears to be human remains, along with personal items belonging to Brian Laundrie, including a backpack and notebook. All apparently were underwater that had recently receded in the Florida Wildlife Preserve they've been combing since September 18th. At a press conference today, headed by the special agent in charge of the Tampa division, the FBI stopped just short of saying they found Laundrie's body.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael McPherson. I'm the special agent in charge of the FBI Tampa division. As you're aware, the FBI and the Northport Police Department and our state and local law enforcement partners have been searching the area of the Carlton Reserve for Brian Laundrie, a person of interest in the murder of Gabby Petito. Earlier today, investigators found what appears to be human remains, along with personal items, such as a backpack and notebook belonging to Brian Laundrie. These items were found in an area that up until recently have been underwater. Our evidence response team is on scene using all available forensic resources to process the area. It's likely the team will be on scene for several days. I know you have a lot of questions, but we don't have all the answers yet. We are working diligently to get those answers for you. We are grateful for the dedication and professionalism of the Northport Police Department, along with our partners from the state and local agencies. Complex investigations such as this cannot be accomplished by one agency alone, but there are just too many agencies to name them all here today. Portions of the Myakkahatchee Creek Environment Park and Carlton Reserve will remain closed to the public until further notice. This is an active and ongoing investigation, so we ask the public to maintain distance from any law enforcement personnel, equipment, vehicles, and other related activity for the safety of the public and to protect the integrity of our work. We have no additional comment related to today's activities. Our FBI Denver office is the lead investigative agency, and all future inquiries should be directed to them. We appreciate the tremendous support from the public and continue to ask for your assistance in bringing this investigation to close. Thank you.
Was the backpack found near the body? Justice for Gabby! Justice for Gabby! Justice for Gabby!
They did not answer any questions beyond that. It's all going down at Carlton Reserve. This is exactly where Laundrie's parents told authorities he might be. Chris and Roberta Laundrie were at the park with authorities this morning when they found the apparent remains and belongings. According to Laundrie's parents, they last saw their son on September 13th. They say went for a hike and never returned. Brian Laundrie remains the only person of interest in the death of his fiancée, Gabby Petito. The Laundrie's lawyer, Stephen Bertolino, releasing this statement today. Chris and Roberta Laundrie were at the reserve earlier today when human remains and some of Brian's possessions were located in an area where they had initially advised law enforcement that Brian may be. Chris and Roberta will wait for the forensic identification of the human remains before making any additional comments. We've got a lot to get to tonight, and this is an ongoing breaking story. Joining us now is NewsNation's Brian Entin. So, Brian, the first question, as we listen to that press conference that I had, is we've heard that the family members of Brian Laundrie, the parents, took them to this area. Did they literally find the items themselves? Meaning, do we know, was it the Laundrie parents who said, that's his backpack, that's his notebook, look what we see?
That's a good question, Dan, and we literally just got the answer. I just got off the phone with Mr. Bertolino, the attorney for the Laundries, and what he says happened is this. He says last night he got a call from the Laundries and that they said, we want to go out and search again in the reserve now that the reserve is back open to the public, because you have to remember the reserve just opened back up to the public yesterday. So the lawyer says he called the police and said, my clients will be out there at 7 a.m. You can meet them out there. Mr. Bertolino says the Laundries, Chris and Roberta, show up to the reserve behind me. The police meet them this morning. They're going down one of the trails where Brian used to hike. Mr. Bertolino says Chris and Roberta were on one side of the trail, and they discovered some personal items of Brian's. And he says the police officers, there were two of them, were on the other side of the trail and discovered Brian's backpack, which led to the human remains on the side of the trail where the backpack was.
And so the obvious follow-up question is, why now? Why weren't they able to direct the authorities to this area earlier? Is this all because of the water?
Well, that's what the lawyer says. He says that this area was flooded for the last several weeks, which is true because we've been out here, and even this road behind me was about a foot underwater a couple of weeks ago. You couldn't even drive in. And that once the water receded, they were able to get to some of these areas that they weren't able to get to before. But it is so strange because for 5 weeks we've been in Northport and watched the FBI from all over the country, advanced drones, airplanes, helicopters, everything you can think of out here in this reserve looking for Brian Laundrie. They come up with nothing for 5 weeks. All of a sudden, Roberta and Chris, Brian's parents, show up this morning, and almost immediately you've got these human remains that are now discovered.
Well, and also the other thing, and I'll ask my guest about this in a moment, is the notion that if it's underwater for that long, right, for weeks potentially, you still are able to find the backpack and the notebook right next to each other, also right near where the remains are found. If it was so far underwater, even that becomes a little bit hard to accept at face value.
Right, and how did they find the backpack, and then how did that lead to the remains, which were apparently a little bit further in? We still don't know all the details. We don't know the condition of the remains, if they were in fact underwater for several weeks. I just got a text from the medical examiner a couple minutes ago. He's saying the latest is they think it'll be 1 to 2 days before they can confirm whether or not it's Brian Laundrie, but he says it's possible that it could take longer.
Yeah. Brian, stay with us if you can. I want to bring in Tracy Walder, former FBI special agent, former CIA officer. Tracy, look, my take is the FBI would not have even said what they said unless they were almost 100% sure this is Brian Laundrie. Do you agree with me?
I do agree with you to a certain extent. I think that they are 100% sure that the backpack, the notebooks, those items that were found close to the remains either had his identifying information on them or were very clearly Brian Laundrie. So I think that they fully believe that it is his body.
And what do you make of this issue about where the items were found and the fact that the lawyer for the Laundrie family is saying, well, this whole area was underwater, and that's the reason the authorities weren't able to get to it, and yet they're able to find a notebook and a backpack and the remains all right next to each other, in essence, if it was all underwater?
So I'm with you. I find this incredibly alarming, quite frankly. I've always felt, I've been following this case really since its inception, that the parents needed to be held more accountable. I believe, and I will always believe, that they knew precisely where he was and really just sort of held on that location for a multitude of reasons. I find this very, very interesting and quite frankly, improbable that the items were found that close together. I know that the search teams have sort of ebbed and flowed depending on how the water has been. I know they kind of pulled back the search, I guess, about a week ago, but then resumed it once the water sort of receded. They were bringing in cadaver dogs, those kinds of things. And I find it very interesting because from what I understand, this area had been searched before, that a cadaver dog didn't sort of hit on it. I found that very interesting. Also, things like, I don't mean to be too graphic, but a body, if it was underwater, actually would probably float away unless it was anchored down. Same with a backpack, same with those items. So I find it very interesting that those were that close together and really highly improbable, quite frankly.
Well, and look, in our next block, I'm going to talk to someone who's an expert in cadaver dogs about some of these very questions that you're raising. But Brian, let me go back quickly to Brian Entin. Brian, again, without getting gruesome here, do we have any sense of the state of the remains that they found?
We do not know particularly the condition of the remains. What we know, according to the FBI, is that they were underwater because this area was flooded. And then again, we know from the medical examiner just within the last 5 minutes that it could take 1 to 2 days for them to identify the remains. He said possibly longer. So I would imagine if these remains were underwater for quite some time, weeks and weeks, I mean, it's been 5 weeks, they're not in good shape right now.
Well, and I guess the only question then, Tracy, could be, is it what, Brian's notebook and Brian's his backpack, and yet somehow it's not Brian's body there?
I mean, that could certainly be the case. Obviously, I don't want to say I'm 100% sure. We never do that in the FBI. I don't ever want to be 100% sure. Obviously, I think there's a high probability. And also, I think too, and again, not to be too graphic, even if they are skeletal remains, you are going to have clothing that's still possibly on those remains. And perhaps the parents were able to identify what he was last seen in. And so I think that there's a high possibility.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would find it shocking if this weren't Brian's remains there. But this whole thing still remains so bizarre. I mean, yes. Brian Entin is out there asking the exact right questions of all of his sources about where the items were, who found them, when they found them, and how they weren't able to find it earlier. Now, look, let me take a quick... Yeah,
for me.
Exactly. No, I agree. I mean, so let's do this. Let's take a break, because coming up, we were talking about cadaver dogs. It's a huge part of the search for Brian Laundrie. And what many people may not know is just how good these dogs are at this very specific job. So how were they not able to find it earlier? And this is a live look at the Laundrie house in Northport, Florida tonight. This is a breaking news story. What appears to be Brian Laundrie's body found. We're coming right back.
Portions of the Myakkahatchee Creek Environment Park and Carlton Reserve will remain closed to the public until further notice. This is an active and ongoing investigation, so we ask the public to maintain distance from any law enforcement personnel, equipment, vehicles, and other related activity for the safety of the public and to protect the integrity of our work.
Welcome back to our breaking coverage. The FBI has found apparent human remains and items belonging to Brian Laundrie in that Florida nature preserve. If we soon learn, as I expect that we will, that the remains are of Brian Laundrie, there almost certainly will be no formal justice for Gabby or her parents.
He's a missing piece of the puzzle to find out what
I
happened.
always say he's the key. He's the key to the puzzle.
Yeah, what happened out there? You know, until they find him, we won't know.
Joining me now outside a memorial for Gabby in her hometown of Blue Point, New York, NewsNation's Tom Nagovian. Tom, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it. So I would assume that based on the fact that we don't have any definitive answers, that there's still not a sense of closure there, correct?
You know, there isn't, Dan, and you know there's some suggestion from locals here that this may never truly end for residents of Blue Point, Long Island. You know, since Gabby disappeared, this memorial has been growing. The streets around us here are adorned in blue ribbons, teal ribbons, color chosen by Nicole Schmidt, Gabby's mother, to match her eyes, she said, reminding her of her daughter's eyes. They've been through something so unthinkable here, Dan, that they're looking for closures, tried as that expression might be, or for those answers, which now locals realize they may never get. Folks here today saying they hope the remains found in Florida are not Brian, because that would deny them those answers and the measure of justice they're seeking for Gabby Petito.
Yeah, I get that. But I think that the hope that may be the case may be a slim one. Tom, thank you very much. Really appreciate that. Again, this is the scene from Carlton Reserve. Medical examiner called to the scene, as well as cadaver dogs. A local canine unit had been at the reserve earlier this month to assist law enforcement searching for Brian. So the question, of course, is how were they not able to find this earlier? Joining me now to talk more about the search is canine handler and former police officer Kyle Hayen. Thanks very much for coming on the program. Appreciate it. So talk to me about the way that cadaver dogs work? I mean, if they had cadaver dogs out there a month ago in this basic area, even if there was water there, would the dogs have been able to find the body?
Thank you for having me. And if the body had been there when they went by with cadaver dogs, and the body had been there for more than 2 or 3 minutes, the odor would have come through the water, and yes, they should have been able to locate that body.
So just to be clear, cadaver dogs can sniff out a body even if it's underwater.
That's correct.
Just quickly, take us through the training that these dogs go through, because I think that some people don't realize that this is different from the way that other police canines are trained.
It is. And there's a couple of different ways of doing it. The methodology that I trained with was you actually use human parts in training the dog. So you bury parts of a human, could have been medical surgery. You let them deteriorate. When I was in Germany doing some training, opened a freezer one time and I looked at all sorts of human parts, not breakfast. So close the door, off we go. But that's what you have to do with a cadaver dog, is you are using human parts. It can't be necessarily from a medical hospital all the time that treats cancer, because you're training a cancer dog and not a human cadaver dog.
So let me ask you this.
Yes.
Knowing what you know, as you do, I mean, you know exactly how these dogs work, what they can find, what they can't find. Does this make sense to you that the cadaver dogs were out there previously and they didn't find anything, and now the family, the parents of Brian Laundrie, go with the authorities to the scene today, and they're almost immediately able to find his personal items and his remains?
It's highly suspicious. If the body was there at that time, X weeks ago, and if it's the same dog and the same quality of dog or same quality of training, yeah, they should have found it. They would have detected Landry's body.
So the question, of course, now becomes, maybe he was still alive at that time. I mean, you know, you have to, if you have the faith in the dogs that you do, you have to believe then that at the time the dogs were there, if they were in this same area, then he wasn't dead at that time, assuming this is his body.
Assuming that it's his body, and it's a lot of things falling into place all at one time. And it's kind of hard for me to swallow. Gee, the parents go there. Gee, they find all this stuff that's supposedly been out there for weeks, and a human body. So, or parts of a human body. So it's, if the dogs are well trained, well maintained, and we're in that area, then yeah, they should have smelled the odor of the human.
Right. All right, Kyle, thank you so much for coming on the show. This is very important insight as we continue to cover this breaking news story. Now, you know, if this is Brian Laundrie's body that has been recovered, many are going to want someone else to pay. And as we've been talking about, there are a lot of people who have been questioning Brian Laundrie's parents. Should they be worried about being charged? Ashley Banfield joins us next.
I know you have a lot of questions, but we don't have all the answers yet. We are working diligently to get those answers for you.
We continue to follow the breaking coverage now surrounding what may be the remains of Brian Laundrie, found today along with his personal items in the very park where authorities had been searching for weeks. If the remains are confirmed to be Brian's, people are going to look for someone else's head on a platter, and the question could be, will that be Brian's parents? Now, we're lucky to have with us a person who knows this case as well as anyone in the country, and she knows how trials work. because she's covered so many of them, my good friend Ashley Banfield. Her show Banfield airs each night here on NewsNation at 10 p.m. Eastern. Ashley, you've been listening to this conversation that we've been having, right? We're trying to figure out how this all fits. Cadaver dogs were there previously, didn't find body. Other dogs were on the scene, didn't find Brian. So what the heck could be going on here? I mean, is it possible that I'm being too conspiratorial and that this really just is a lot simpler than it seems?
I don't think you're being conspiratorial. I want to know why I'm now hearing other reporting as well that these remains were found 2 to 3 miles in from where the Mustang was parked. It's about a 45-minute walk, and if you ask me, it shouldn't take 38 days to go radiating out from the Mustang, especially if you're 45 minutes in. So all of this is just confounding, but I think what's even more confounding, Dan, and I know this is not lost on you, this story from the legal representative, the lawyer for the Laundries, Bertolino, saying they just decided to come in and help today, and 30 minutes later, the remains are found. None of this is making sense. I dare say that I think it's inarticulate texting, maybe, that there's more to it.
Yeah, I mean, because remember, the claim that Bertolino is now making is, well, you know, this area was underwater, so they couldn't access it before. And now suddenly the water's receded, and Brian Entin confirmed that there's been flooding there, et cetera.
Sure.
But as you just heard, the expert I just had on, who's an expert with cadaver dogs, made it clear that if that body was there, even underwater, the cadaver dogs would have gotten it.
Because of you, Dan Abrams, I became rather friendly with the Pasco County Sheriff's outfit because of Live PD, you know.
Yep.
So I rang up my old pals at the Pasco County outfit and I said, I know you have the only cadaver dog in town. Can they sniff even if there's water? The answer was yes. So I don't want to hear this baloney about the water. Oh, we couldn't do it. That is not an impediment. Maybe it's a bummer to walk through it, but they were already walking through waist-high water elsewhere in the reserve. I just can't understand, first of all, and foremost here, why the Laundries are saying, we just thought we'd give a looky-loo last night, and then lo and behold, 30 minutes later, none of that makes sense. And by the way, when it comes to the Laundries, I don't think anyone should suggest for a minute right now they're off the hook. I think there is a lot more to this investigation. I think that the probable cause existed to tap them and to follow them and to check their digital footprint to know if they were building sandwiches for Brian Laundrie to go on a longer hike than overnight.
You know, I was one of these people who was sort of privately defending the Laundries, right? When people would ask me about this story, I would say, well, you know, look, they've told the authorities where to search. They obviously believe them because they're searching in this area. And now they find the body, or they found what may be the body, right in the area where they told them to search. But then as we start digging in here and I start thinking about the way that the dogs have searched up to now, the timing of this, and the fact that, again, I don't trust the Laundrie's attorney, and I've been very critical of him up to this point, it's suddenly hitting me that I'm saying, taking the position that I think you've been taking for a long time now, I'm coming around to it to say, I think that there really may be more here.
Look, you know how it works. You're the guy that spent all those hours in a classroom learning the law. It's pretty simple, even for the lay people, and that is that if there's a warrant, then you can't harbor. Harbor comes in all sorts, shapes, and colors. You give sandwiches, you give money, you give a bed, you give a roof, you give a ride. Those are all harbor. So there's a timeline that would have to be hit, right? Because those charges didn't come right away. They came kind of, in the middle of his journey. So if they did anything, even typing or searching or wiring or dropping off a bag. And by the way, that's not so crazy, Dan. I interviewed a guy this week who was on the run for 2 years, and his mom FedExed him brownies and called him every month. How do you like that? So that can be done, and it's not out of the realm of possibilities. And if the Laundries are super, super smart, they wouldn't have been doing anything like that. But if they're not the sharpest tools in the shed, they might have thought they could get one over on authorities.
And Ashley makes a very good point that, remember, that timeline is from the moment that Brian Laundrie is indicted on that,
Right.
even that silly claim with regard to bank fraud. At that point, he's a fugitive. And at that point, the legal responsibility of the family escalates. Ashley Banfield, thank you so much.
No, Dan, hold on one second.
Real quick.
I've got a guest coming up that may actually push you earlier than that timeline, because if they thought something was coming and they helped him get on his way prior, there may be exposure there as well. That surprised me.
But right. Well, that would be because they then would have lied to the authorities, and then you are in trouble, right? So it has to be either that they deceived the authorities, but they aren't responsible. They weren't required to help the authorities in any way. Anyway,
Correct.
You're going to be talking about this more. Banfield tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern. Ashley, great to see you. Coming up, is it a case of suicide by cop? A man wearing body armor reverses into a patrol car, then gets out, approaches officers. The whole thing caught on tape, body and dash cam. We're going to take you through it in a moment. Welcome back. Time for our police cam segment, showing the dangers police officers face every day across the country. Tonight, we're getting a look at what happened after a driver backed into a police cruiser in Los Angeles. The LAPD released both dash cam and an officer's body cam video. I want to warn you, some may find the video disturbing.
Shots fired. Shots hit his back. Whoa!
Put your hand down! Put it down! Put it down! Put it down!
The officer even fired through his window there. Two officers were responding to another call when they went to make a left turn, and a man in a Hyundai Sonata in front of them suddenly backed into their cruiser. Richard Solitro Jr. got out of the car and threatened to shoot the police as he counted to 3. Could you hear that? He pulled his hand from behind his back. Turned out he was holding a piece of paper, but thinking he had a gun, officers opened fire. Police and paramedics tried to revive him, but Solitro died at the scene. He was unarmed but wearing body armor, and it is not the first time he's been shot by police. In 2018, he was living in Rhode Island when relatives called 911, saying Solitro was going to harm himself. He pointed a fake gun at officers who opened fire. Here to break down this unbelievable moment is attorney Shaka Johnson, who was also a detective in Fulton County, Georgia. Thank you so much for coming back on the show. We appreciate it. All right, so the suspect backs into a police car, then takes his hand from behind his back as if he's pulling a gun, and he had done a countdown there. This is an example of a split-second decision officers have to make.
Thanks for having me again. And yes, this is exactly what this is. It's a very harrowing experience for police officers. And this is clearly, at least to me anyway, suicide by a police officer, or otherwise known as suicide by cop. It doesn't help that this gentleman has a history of doing something very similar. And it's one of those scenarios where people who are either depressed or very desperate or somehow have some moral aversion to taking their own life put police officers in a compromising position to have to make these sort of split-second decisions. And it usually ends this way. It didn't work out that way for him in 2018 when he pulled a fake pistol on police, which is usually the way the suicide by cop is done. So in this instance, he initiates contact by backing his vehicle up and causing a traffic accident, putting himself in their direct line of sight, concealing one of his hands, and then doing a countdown. There's not much more he could have done to institute this sort of reaction.
I want to replay that part, though, because you mentioned that the suspect yelling at police to get out of their car, threatened the officers. He counted down. Let's listen to that again. the numbers you heard there were coming from the suspect. And I think, Shaka, one of the things that people don't think about a lot is that for these officers, they're going to have to now recover from this incident. This is a psychologically debilitating moment for these officers having had to go through this.
Especially, and it's a different psychological trauma than if you have to institute lethal force to protect yourself. Once you learn that someone, the cosmos, the universe has chosen you for suicide by cop, and you were instrumental in this person's plan to end their life on a particular day, and then a guy pulls out a piece of paper from behind his back. Those officers, even the officers who are just present to observe it, will not be the same. There's going to have to be lots of therapy to make them whole again.
Yeah. Shaka Johnson, thank you for coming back. Appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you. Good to see you again as well.
Coming up, you may have heard about the man accused of raping a woman on a train, while police say people watched and did nothing. But what you may not have heard in the mainstream media is that the suspect was in this country illegally and had pled guilty to a sex crime in another case. This isn't a border issue, it's a legal issue. How is he still in the country? Welcome back. It's no secret that our immigration system is in desperate need of reform. But the alleged sexual assault of a woman last week on a train in Philadelphia by an immigrant here illegally has exposed one of the most obvious flaws. When someone is here illegally and they commit a crime and serve time for it, that should be cause enough to deport them, period. The suspect, Fiston Nagoy, had previously pled guilty to sexual abuse and served 4 months. Somehow a judge decided that crime wasn't, quote, serious enough for deportation. I think this is a striking failure in our legal system. Now, I'm not going to give this the Fox News treatment and claim this shows you that anyone and everyone here without proper documentation is evil, or the MSNBC CNN treatment, which is to ignore the story, or at least this part of it. It just seems like common sense that when someone is here illegally, commits a sex crime, and serves time, that person doesn't just get sent home. What is the definition of not serious enough? Nagoy came to the U.S. legally in 2012 on a student visa. The 35-year-old Congolese national's visa was terminated in 2015 because he failed to remain a student. Meanwhile, court records show that he racked up multiple arrests and 2 misdemeanor convictions. Nagoy was convicted of drug possession in 2015, pled guilty in 2017 to a sexual abuse misdemeanor after he groped 2 women on the street near a homeless shelter where he was staying. He would go on to serve 120 days in jail. Now, he was put in immigration detention in 2018, but was never deported because he received a, quote, withholding of removal from an immigration judge after the Board of Immigration Appeals found that his misdemeanor sex offense was not a, quote, serious crime that would have made him ineligible to stay in the United States. He just had the provision that he had to check in with immigration authorities. All right. Now, we have the sexual assault, October 13th, where Nagoy allegedly raped a woman on a commuter train. According to police, a transportation authority employee got on the train, saw what was happening, called 911. The assault lasted about 8 minutes, they say. No passengers on the train intervened or called 911. That is a separate, incredibly disturbing issue. But those who support immigrants in this country should agree with me. And I'm not saying a kid who was brought here by their parents should be immediately deported for jaywalking. But if you want a rational, reasonable immigration system, it has to start with criminals being deported. Joining me now is Adriana Estevez, an immigration attorney and managing partner for Worley, Dahlberg, and Yao. Thank you very much for coming on the program. Appreciate it. So am I missing something here about the sort of definition of a serious crime, et cetera?
So I think for immigration purposes, there is what are considered serious crimes are aggravated felonies, right? And an aggravated felony neither has to be aggravated nor a felony. It just has to be a sentencing for some kind of a crime that a charge for some kind of a crime for which you were convicted that received a sentencing of at least a year. So for immigration purposes, it kind of almost seems a little straightforward straightforward that most of these cases, especially sexual assault cases or sexual abuse cases, would be automatically deportable. The problem is that there's a lot of exceptions and there's a lot of kind of loopholes in the system that make it a little bit easier for individuals to either plead to lesser inclusive charges or plead to certain things that will eliminate certain aspects of the code, which make it a bit more palatable, I would say, to an immigration judge. And so you can get determinations of withholding in circumstances like this.
But do you agree with me? I mean, look, you work with people who are trying to get into this country legally or trying to stay here, whatever the case may be. Do you agree with me that when a judge makes a decision like this, whether it sort of follows the letter of the law or doesn't, that it's bad for people you want to help? Meaning, shouldn't we create a system whereby someone like this, who has served 4 months on a sex crime, should be deported immediately?
I would agree. I think when it's that clear, when it's this kind of an offense, there are just certain circumstances wherein, there are individuals that just give immigrants, unfortunately, a bad name. They set a bad reputation for a lot of the families that are struggling, that do deserve benefits, a lot of the people that are doing it the right way and that are taking care of, making sure that they're not committing any crimes and that they are, being safe here in the United States. And it does make it more difficult for them. It definitively does.
And that's why I'm trying not to sort of just do the demonization you would see, for example, as I mentioned on Fox News, where they would be saying all the this, all the that, this shows you that everyone, et cetera. No, this just seems to me like common sense, that when something like this simply should not happen, and that if it does, for whatever reason, follow the law, then we have to change the law. Then we simply just can't have a system whereby someone can serve 4 months on a sex crime, knowing that the person's here illegally, have the person have been arrested on another crime as well, and somehow they're still in the country. And it wasn't just a mistake. That's the thing. It wasn't just like he fell through the cracks. There was a decision made here by a judge that said, this isn't serious enough. And I just think that is so dangerous for everyone.
Yeah, and I don't disagree, but I would highlight, though, that in this case, when a judge is deciding withholding, right, they are also balancing something. I don't know in this circumstance what his case was, but he's saying, or the judge said, that it's incredibly likely, so that's more than just likely, that he's going to suffer in some kind of a serious way if he were to return. So the immigration judge is theoretically balancing those two things. Although, honestly, when it comes to sexual assault, rape, murder, some very serious cases and charges like that, I mean, it should be, I think, a little bit more easy to get somebody out.
And I think, and I honestly think, and you've said this, that people like you should be out on the forefront saying, we need to change this because this is making it really bad for my clients. It's making life much harder for the good people who are trying to do good things if this is the way that the system works. Adriana, thank you very much for taking the time. Really appreciate your expertise.
Thank you for having me.
Coming up, the NBA season is back. The fans are pumped, but maybe a little too enthusiastic for TV. Yeah, whoever has their hand on the bleep button was busy last night. It's coming up next.